Good evening and welcome to another mandatory Friday Night In with Novara Media's Tisky Sour. I'm Michael Walker. As ever, I'm joined from the south coast of England by Novara Media co-founder Aaron Bastani. How are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. How are you keeping?
Very well. I've been entertaining myself today with the Twitter videos of Donald Trump, which I'm delighted we found an excuse to talk about today. And to do so, we're going to be also joined by Sarah Jaffe.
Hello.
How's it going? Sarah is author of Necessary Trouble and a very good friend of the show. You're speaking to us, I think, from Philadelphia.
Indeed.
How intense is your lockdown? When was the last time you went outside?
Well, I have a dog, so I have to go outside 3 times a day, which is a great excuse to have to leave. Yeah, he's snoring on the bed here, so I apologize in advance if you can hear the snoring. But other than that, I also have to sneak into New Jersey to buy alcohol, which is a thing. State liquor laws are very strange, so I actually have to get in the car and cross state lines to be able to buy booze right now because Pennsylvania closed all the liquor stores.
Oh, wow. Oh, so the liquor stores in Pennsylvania are not essential businesses, but they are essential businesses in New Jersey.
To explain Pennsylvania liquor laws would take about 3 hours, so I'm just going to say yes and leave it there.
We'll do that for another show. That's very interesting, though.
It's weird.
Tonight, we are going to spend the first half of the show talking about American politics, President Trump advising people to do some fairly dangerous things with household products. And then also we'll discuss whether or not it's a growing movement or just an AstroTurf movement. But in any case, the protests to end the lockdown in the United States coming from the sort of Trumpist right. Then in the second half of the show, me and Aaron are going to discuss 2 big stories from the United Kingdom. One about potential food shortages, not because of logistics problems and delivering food to the supermarkets like we saw at the beginning of March, but instead because there aren't enough people to pick food out in the fields. And we're also going to talk about Britain being an outlier in terms of not having really put any regulation whatsoever on international travel. First of all, you're watching Tisky Sour. Please, we want more people to watch this stream live. We want to get them in right now. So share this stream on your social media feeds. That's, I think, my only ask, actually. Fox hates it when we do this, but yeah, we're working out what asks we do when. So you can comment on what you think is best. All right, first story. Last night, Donald Trump gave a press conference where he sort of delivered some medical advice about what treatments might be effective in the face of coronavirus. They were all rather obscure. He had his, medical officer in chief there looking pretty awkward. We're going to go to the first clip now.
I would like you to speak to the medical doctors to see if there's any way that you can apply light and heat to cure. That if you could, and maybe you can, maybe you can't. Again, I say maybe you can, maybe you can't. I'm not a doctor, but I'm like a person that has a good, what.
But sir, you're the president.
Deborah, have you ever heard of that? The heat and the light relative to certain viruses, yes, but relative to this virus?
Not as a treatment. I mean, certainly fever is a good thing when you have a fever. It helps your body respond. But I've not seen heat or light.
I think it's a great thing to look at. I mean, okay.
So the incredibly pained woman there was Dr. Deborah Birx. She is the coordinator for the White House's coronavirus task force. She looks deeply traumatized being sat there. She's quite polite, really, isn't she? Because she says, "Oh, the heat and light cure." I mean, I haven't read that. She doesn't say it's complete bullshit. I mean, people on the internet today have sort of been saying, "Oh, she should have sort of stood up and walked out." I can kind of understand why, if you are a medical professional. She was an appointee of the Obama administration, so she's not a Trump lackey. I can understand why in the middle of a global pandemic you'd want, someone to be in the room to tell Donald Trump not to encourage the American people to drink bleach. I know where do you stand on that particular moral quandary that she's in? Should she be sitting there listening to it all, or do you think she should be, calling him out as the completely insane idiot he is when it comes to coronavirus?
I admire her ability to keep a straight face. I have no idea what I would have done, right? Because you saw me. I've seen this 3 times. I still can't stop laughing. And then I remember that I live in the country that this man is the president of, and that's kind of terrifying. So, but yeah, I don't know what I think you should do, really. We need people to be running this show that know more than Trump does, but I can't tell you what the answer is there.
So that was Donald Trump suggesting that potentially heat and light could treat coronavirus. I think the background there is that if you have sort of like a virus on a surface, then sunlight and heat can, stop its or limit its survival there, but it's not something that you can sort of inject into your veins like he seemed to be suggesting there. Get it inside you. But that wasn't his craziest suggestion of the press conference. Let's go to his next piece of advice about what could be a promising treatment for coronavirus.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number in the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.
Feel sorry for me. Can I apply for asylum?
Yeah, I mean, because we had a crazy government, when it came to sort of like the first phases of coronavirus. They were like, we don't need a lockdown. We're just going to let it run through the population. We'll have 60% get infected by June. So we all felt a bit vulnerable, like we were not in safe hands. But I mean, Boris Johnson has never got up in front of the lectern and told us all to drink bleach.
Drink bleach. No, you have not been told to drink bleach or inject it into your veins. And, I mean, I don't know if anybody's actually going to do it. I really hope not. It's really kind of terrifying that like bleach companies are putting disclaimers on their websites now that they're like, we can't believe we have to say this, but please don't take this internally. And, I mean, the president's already been hyping medication that has no proven effectiveness. And this is like a long-standing sort of right-wing grift to try to sell things. I don't think this was even that, right? Like if you watch Fox News, you'll get endless ads for sort of weird medications and quack cures that people, including people that I know, have spent money on. But this is just literally like he gets in front of a camera and he's just rambling and says the first thing that comes to mind. And this poor woman has to sit there and just take it and say things like, no, that's not a good idea, sir. And it's depressing. And also, like, we shouldn't be airing these press conferences live. There's no news value to this whatsoever. It's ridiculous that anybody is still putting these on broadcast.
Can I just say, I mean, America's a crazy, Britain's a crazy country, but America's a really crazy country.
Yes.
And one of the craziest kind of things I've seen happen there in the last few years is was the Tide Pods thing. And for people who aren't aware, Tide Pods are kind of they're like a detergent that you stick in the washing machine. And people were eating this as a challenge, the Tide Pod challenge. And it's got so wacky in America that the president is effectively instructing people to do the Tide Pod challenge. The Tide Pod challenge as a Twitter hashtag was insane. But now the president's saying it in national press conferences in the middle of a pandemic to do something actually probably more dangerous than eat a Tide Pod.
Yes.
It's like, I guess, but like you say, Sarah, there's heritage here. The whole thing on the US right of like colloidal silver and people taking colloidal silver to stop cancer, and they end up having like blue skin. There's just like this really wacky, almost surreal strain of like quack science on the American right, which Donald Trump is channeling. You don't think it's going to be popular? You don't think the electorate kind of?
Hopefully, the electorate has enough sense to not drink bleach. We're about to get to the protesters who want to reopen everything. So we do have some proof that some of our people aren't bonkers. But, I think it's important to note that there are limits. There's also limits to how much people are actually watching these daily press conferences. Like, I think probably more than usual because people are on lockdown. But I don't know that everybody's hanging on every word that Trump says and thinking like, oh, great. Yeah, let's inject some Clorox. So I don't know. I don't know about that. I hope not. But like, I'm also kind of wondering if over the next few days, we're going to see some news headlines that are a little scary.
I mean, my My favorite thing about obviously it's terrible, and I shouldn't laugh about you having this idiot for a president in the middle of a global pandemic. And I don't imagine many people are going to inject bleach. I've seen some people sort of saying you shouldn't laugh at this because it's serious. You're having a powerful political figure encouraging people to do something incredibly dangerous. But I don't think many people are as that stupid. I don't know. But I mean, one thing I like about this particular instance of him talking nonsense is often you need a journalist to sort of say, the background here is that Sean Hannity said it on this show because it sort of got big on a 4chan website sort of a week ago. And, you can sort of delve into where did this crazy story come from? And this is just literally, he read the bottle of like Mr. Muscle, which said kills 99% of germs and viruses. And he was like, oh, maybe if we got that inside of our bodies, right? So it's like you don't even you can't find the root of this conspiracy theory because no one else has looked at the bottle of disinfectant which says it kills bacteria and thought, well, if it kills bacteria on the on the toilet, maybe it could kill viruses in this case, isn't it? Maybe it could kill viruses inside me. Anyway. Well, we didn't mention it, but on the first video, actually, I think he says, I'm not a doctor. I'm just someone with a big something. Kind of Biden-esque that one was.
But the whole thing about the high sort of temperatures killing virus. I mean, there's a grain. That's the only thing he's talking about. Where there's like a grain of truth, like a kernel of truth, which is often the case with sort of Trump's craziness.
That's not a treatment, though. That's why it might spread slower in some environments.
Yeah, I don't mean temperatures, climate temperatures. I'm saying, for instance, when people try and eradicate viruses in a lab, you'll use extreme heat, for instance, to destroy a virus if it's being used for testing. But that's not always the case. There are some viruses, for instance, which have been found which can sustain thousands of degrees C. They have to be buried underground in concrete bunkers because they're so dangerous, biological weapons and so on. So the idea that like, oh yeah, you sort of boil a kettle and a bit of spray bleach, just kind of there's just I've just realized actually something got put in the notes that I hadn't seen since we went live, and there actually is more of a backstory to the bleach thing than him just looking at a bottle. So we'll get to that in a moment. But before we do, and also to talk about whether this will actually damage his electoral chances, I want to go to what I thought was a hilarious video, which is the same moment you watched there, but focusing on Dr. Deborah Birx, who is the coordinator for the White House's coronavirus task force and a qualified physician. This is how she reacted to Donald Trump's ramblings.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because
this poor woman.
Yeah. Also, I looked her up because he said if you were a medical doctor, but we need to ask the medical doctors this one. I looked on her Wikipedia. She is a physician, so she's a medical doctor, right? She just doesn't work on the front line anymore because she's now just a top immunologist. I think that's her current position.
Yeah.
I love the way she breathes out, like towards the end. She goes kind of in like a national press conference. It's not over the phone, She's not like in her living room.
Well, I mean, she's got to cover her back in a way, doesn't she? Because she can't be nodding along while he's saying that you can cure coronavirus with UV rays and bleach,
antibacterial wipes.
I really would love to know what went through her head in that moment. I can't wait for her memoir when this is all over.
Anyway, we should go to this.
Can I ask you a quick question, Sarah?
Yeah, come on.
Is there anybody in the Republican Party who would say something more wacky than what? I mean, I'm just wondering who are his outriders here?
Well,
who are the people saying even more crazy stuff to make this look normal?
I thought you were going to ask if there were any of them that actually have some sense, because I mean there are members of the Republican Party who are actual doctors who have said bonkers stuff like this, like Ron Paul, actually a doctor. So who's gone further than this? I mean, the governor of Georgia has reopened things. You can go get a haircut in Georgia right now, or, you know, a haircut with the side of coronavirus. There's, the thing is that there are probably plenty of people who realize that this is nuts, right? That this is a man who's clearly sort of lost it, but he won an election, and he's never been popular. I mean, that's the first thing. Like, he's literally never had approval ratings over 50%, which is really rare for an American president. Like, George W. Bush had 91% approval ratings right after 9/11. Like, we've had some pretty useless people as president who had pretty high approval ratings at some point. So nevertheless, like, they are sort of afraid to challenge him too much because he's got this base, and the size of the base is still, again, sort of overhyped and overstressed. And again, we're going to get to this point with these protests, but they are sort of scared that, like, he will mobilize the sort of fringes of the Republican base against them. And yet, you know, now what we're seeing when they're having these fights in Congress about these bailouts, and now Mitch McConnell essentially said, like, he's going to let the states go bankrupt. I'm going to be really interested to see what happens with these Republican governors versus Trump and McConnell in the next few weeks. So, because, like, it's an election year. Most of these jerks want to get reelected. They want to maintain power, and they want to not have the economy of their state completely collapse and have, 25%, 35% of their constituents unemployed. So I guess we'll see.
We're going to go to this backstory about the bleach, right? So this is, and I'm sort of learning this as I'm reading it. So the bleach treatment started from the cult leader Mark Grennan.
Oh, goodness.
And the Guardian revealed tonight he had written to Trump about bleach being a miracle cure for coronavirus. So we're going to get a quote from that article. So Grennan styles himself as Archbishop of Genesis 2, a Florida-based outfit that claims to be a church, but which in fact is the largest producer and distributor of chlorine dioxide bleach as a miracle cure in the US. He brands the chemical as MMS, Miracle Mineral Solution, and claims fraudulently that it can cure 99% of all illnesses, including cancer, malaria, HIV, AIDS, as well as autism. And
why does autism always get included in these things?
Yeah, Fox is saying on the internal chat that he's watched this Grennan guy. He snorts bleach, puts it in his eyes, does everything you can imagine with it. So this is like, I mean, this probably now I've got this element of the story. I mean, this guy presumably has, he wouldn't have a business model unless he'd sold some people this miracle mineral solution. So there probably are some really, tragic outcomes here where, someone has taken this bleach to cure their disease, and maybe they're quite desperate and couldn't access American healthcare because they were uninsured or whatever. So I mean, I'm sure there are some tragic stories which come from this, but I mean, the fact that this is now being, spoken from the presidential lectern is just bananas. Oof. Let's move on to the campaign to reopen America, the protest, AstroTurf or otherwise. Before we do that, share the show link. We want to get more people watching this live. Tweet on the hashtag TiskiSour. We'll obviously go to your comments and questions at the end of the show. There are 1,165 of you watching. Smash the like button. Then we get more likes and we do better in the algorithms. Okay. The move to reopen America. We've talked about Trump being an idiot, but there is a genuine move to shift policy on COVID-19 to end the lockdowns and social distancing, to face the consequences, whatever they might be, depending on who you're speaking to save the economy or to respect America's founding values of individual freedom. This has mainly been centered on an AstroTurf movement to reopen states where governors have implemented lockdowns. We can probably get some footage of one of those up as we talk now. So these movements do seem to be quite small in number, but they've garnered a lot of media attention. They're sort of people saying, what have we got there? End the shutdown, give me liberty, or give me COVID-19. It's a very interesting banner there. How seriously should we be taking these protests and this movement, Sarah?
Yeah, so it's kind of Tea Party 2.0, right? In that, like, they're pretty small, and yet the media hype for them has been huge. And this was true of the Tea Party too, right? That, like, oh my God, Fox News made itself the sort of personal news broadcaster of the Tea Party, which was, I mean, if you don't remember, for our viewers who are not familiar with this, the Tea Party was the brainchild of a guy whose name is literally Dick Armey. Who is one of the many people who's really good at sort of funneling money. Yes, actually, Dick Armey. Dick Armey had a Dick Armey. It was great. He's one of these people who's very good at funneling money from rich people into the pockets of people who are willing to sort of go make asses of themselves in public. And so the Tea Party sort of blended this pre-existing anger, right-wing populist sentiment that already existed with anger at the financial crisis, which is a legitimate thing to be angry about. And then, of course, you know, we had just elected a black man president, and there were a lot of people who were really freaked out by that idea. So that was round one. This thing is, as far as I can tell, a lot of people who are in states where they don't see that many people and they don't hear sirens going by every, you know, few hours the way I do. They're certainly not anywhere near New York City where everybody can tell what's going on. And they kind of just believe that it's not that bad. It's kind of like getting a cold and then you'll get better. And maybe for a few of them that would be the case. But like, other people are dying. And, you know, it's horrifying and ridiculous. And you kind of laugh at the guy with the sign that says, give me liberty or give me COVID-19, or the woman with the sign that said, I want a haircut, which was kind of really telling, because like the base of these things, like the base of the Tea Party, was always these sort of middle-class small business types. And when you're thinking about like these people who are demanding that things reopen, well, like we're allowed to go outside. Like the cops, I mean, I do see cops walking around my neighborhood sometimes, but like they're not stopping you for walking down the street, right? And I'm in a place where the lockdown's pretty intense. So like you can go do things. What you can't do is demand somebody give you a haircut because the hair salons are closed. You can't go to a restaurant. So like what they're actually calling for is, in a way, like people to go back to work. They want everybody to come back to work to serve them, which I think is really interesting. But like, there's also something about it that just says something about the way that a lot of Americans are really disconnected from other people's lives. So if you don't know somebody who's had it or works in healthcare, you can kind of shrug and go, it's not that bad.
Yeah. I mean, there else, I suppose I have seen a couple of more sort of sympathetic takes, not in the sense that sort of like you should be on the side of these protests, but you should take seriously the ones who are sort of saying, we need to work because we can't survive otherwise. So, you know, as a working class movement, to say if you're not giving us proper financial protections, then you can't tell us not to go into work. I don't know if is that just a contrarian thing that I might have seen.
I mean, I don't think that that's who these protesters are. That's certainly true. There are people, I mean, I haven't gotten my $1,200 check yet. I know probably a lot of people are in the same boat, trying to get through to unemployment. The last numbers that I saw this week, when we had another 4.4 million people lose their job, or, well, we don't know how many have lost their jobs. We know how many have applied for unemployment. So another 4.4 million, bringing it over 20 million people unemployed. Something like 70% of the people who have applied are now getting their unemployment money. So that's a whole lot of people who aren't. And that's just the people who qualify for unemployment. Then there's a whole bunch of other things we could talk about forever. And the media does a crappy job of understanding how the unemployment system works, which is why I spent a while this week complaining about an NPR story on the subject. But like, I don't think that that's who these protesters are. Because this is, as you mentioned before, like sort of being hyped by Trump. It's being hyped by right-wing press. It's being funded and supported and encouraged by these same sort of astroturf groups, again, that back the Tea Party. This is a particular faction of the American right that is kind of like, I keep thinking of Greg Grandin's wonderful book, The End of the Myth, which came out this year. Greg is he's actually a Latin American historian. And so this book has a lot to do with American borders and the myth of expansion and our relationship with Mexico, which is very interesting. But he also sort of makes this argument that for a lot of people, American freedom is this sort of freedom from restraint. And that includes like freedom from restraint from oppressing other people. And so a big part of American sort of quote unquote freedom has always been like the freedom to own slaves, the freedom to drive Native people off their land, right? Like those are deeply foundational American ideas. And so this kind of, don't tread on me, give me liberty, give me death. It's always sort of liberty for whom and to do what. And so when I see, sort of Karen with the sign saying, give me, I want a haircut, it doesn't sound that different to me from like people who are, saying like, I need to be able to, have my land and have my slaves. Like it's obviously not quite that much, but it's this history of like, I deserve to be waited on hand and foot. I deserve to be served. This is what freedom actually is.
I want to talk a bit about whether on taking such a strong position on this, Trump has found himself at odds with the public mood and whether sort of he might have done a misstep as a populist. Let's get up some of his tweets from last week. So he tweeted, "Liberate Virginia and save your great Second Amendment. It is under siege. Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota." So he's, backing very explicitly the protesters against the lockdown. I mean, my assumption here is not pretty obvious one, is that he is worried that if the lockdown sort of tanks the economy and the unemployment is still at the levels it currently is by November, that's going to, damage his electoral chances. I mean, my concern, my hope also, but my concern with that particular strategy of his is that whilst, an economic crisis is damaging for the president, trying to end a lockdown in the middle of a pandemic when the lockdown has public support could potentially be even worse. I just want to get a quote from the BBC piece, but it's reporting a Pew Research poll to show what the public mood is here. A Pew Research Center survey last week found 66% of Americans are concerned that restrictions will be lifted too quickly, as opposed to 32% who are worried they will not be lifted soon enough. In addition, the survey found most of the country, regardless of party affiliation, believes the worst of the pandemic is yet to come. And I suppose this, my question to you, Sarah, is that Donald Trump has sort of relied on there being a very polarized electorate in the United States and him being able to mobilize the right people in the right places to win in the Electoral College. And one thing we've seen in the UK is that coronavirus has sort of has become way more important than any of the divides that were currently, stitching together different coalitions. So we all thought, oh, we're in this new culture war where it's leave and remain. But now Boris Johnson is on, 53% or whatever, because coronavirus has become more important. People think he's dealing with it well, so he's incredibly popular. If there could be many people in those specific states who might have been inclined to support Trump's ethno-nationalism, but won't support someone who's trying to get them to not only drink bleach but also reopen their economy in the middle of a global pandemic and potentially kill some of their elderly relatives. Do you think this could be what wins Biden, however shit a candidate he is, the presidential election in November?
Maybe. I think one of the things that we have to watch here is Trump is going to try to play to the ethno-nationalism, right? He keeps calling it the Chinese virus. He's going to try to blame China. And like Biden has showed his total willingness to double down on that strategy, which is terrible, by running this awful ad saying like, well, Trump actually rolled over for China. Like, please kill me. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like these protests, the amount of hype these protests have gotten versus like the amount of people that they represent is sort of like the Tea Party, right? Like we have precedent for this not that long ago, is all out of proportion, right? So that the idea that these protests are representing a sort of major strand in American politics right now, there's nothing that bears that out, right? There's absolutely no evidence that that's actually real. Most people, as you just showed in the numbers, right, think that what we're doing is correct and maybe not even enough. And that's because most people are seeing and hearing what's actually going on. They know that this is serious. Like my mother watches Fox News. My mother is not going out and protesting to, demand to reopen South Carolina, even though, South Carolina probably will reopen soon because that's what's going to happen. That's where it's going to be. It's going to be these southern states with Republican governors, like our friend in Georgia and our friends in Florida. So I think there are many things we're going to have to watch between now and November. One of them being this, the lockdown ending, the unemployment numbers, what Congress does or doesn't do, state bankruptcies. That's the fun thing that I'm thinking a lot right now. There's going to be a lot that moves now, obviously, between and what is it? It's April 24th, Sarah, because it's your birthday. You know what day it is. And yeah, we've got a ways to go. We've got a campaign that hasn't even really started yet because I keep not knowing where Joe Biden is. And like I said, that one campaign ad is terrible. But I don't think that this is like a major populist strategy that's going to get Trump anywhere.
Aaron, what do you have any thoughts, comments on whether watching these press conferences makes you feel more confident that we won't have 4 more years of Donald Trump, even if it's only to be replaced with someone with terrible politics and who can't finish a sentence, but not he's still not Donald Trump?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the crisis is much bigger than Trump's capacity to kind of solve it as a political problem. Far beyond it. You're looking at, I think, about 45,000 deaths so far in the United States. I think once it goes beyond that psychologically, I mean, what was Vietnam like? 55, 60,000? Once it goes beyond that, people go, because that's a huge sort of cultural memory for the United States. People go, wow, this is huge. This is a really significant moment. And it's a very memorable line. More people have died because of this than because of Vietnam. However, what I would say is, I'll take the contrarian take you take, Michael. Fundamentally, many parts of the United States are unaffected by this. There's a great map of coronavirus cases and deaths by state, by county. And many places which would generally vote Republican are fine. The places that are very badly affected and voted Republican last time round are the places that matter. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. And so I do think there's a problem there for Trump. I think that base in the Midwest and the South, I think, he can probably say this stuff and it probably doesn't make a big difference. But in those particular states, which basically swung it for him in 2016, I think he has a significant political problem.
I did see one thing that suggested that potentially enough Trump voters could be killed by coronavirus to swing the election in some of those key states.
Well, that's a terrible thought.
You what?
That's a terrible thought. Come on now.
No, I mean, it was. I don't know if the article was saying it's a good thing. I think it was a political science article. It wasn't a comment piece.
Your politician said that, like, oh, the pensioners are going to die, and then somebody was like, hey, those are our voters.
Yeah, well, that was the Conservatives' original line. Was so, they're old anyway, but it was like they could still. Yeah, they're your main.
One of the things, though, in terms of that map that Aaron was just talking about, that's really important right now, is that like this is centered in the big cities right now, but when it gets to those places, when it gets to rural America, they have no healthcare capacity. There are not hospitals for miles. Like that in New York, you can get healthcare. There is a somewhat functional public hospital infrastructure. Andrew Cuomo sort of commanding and controlling all the hospitals in New York State right now. Like you will get seen if you are sick. If you live in rural South Carolina, it might take 3 hours to get to the nearest hospital. And like, so this thing hitting those places is going to be awful. And, they're more distributed. They come into contact with fewer people, but like it, just because it's not happening yet doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And they are the ones right now that are reopening. And like, again, Georgia, like I want to know how many of those people went to that barbershop are going to come down with coronavirus next week. So, I think that's this assumption that certain parts of the country will just like be clear of it. And it's just a blue state problem, or the thing that, a lot of people are noticing, which is that it is mostly killing Black and brown people. Therefore, most of the people you saw at those protests are white people who are kind of like, well, it'll kill us anyway. Those things are all going to play into this. And then, sorry, there was something else I was going to say and I lost it. Go ahead. I'm sure you have.
I think we're probably going to let you go now because we're going to move to a couple of UK-based stories. Unless you look like you wanted to say something quickly, Aaron.
There was one thing, which is that in complaining about how much media that these protests are getting, I should not forget to say that there have been other protests and actions happening across the country that also represent probably more people. Like, for instance, the nurses who had a National Day of Action last Wednesday, the 15th. And they, they're calling for more PPE. They're calling for more equipment, more attention. They're calling for a national healthcare system because, our healthcare system is completely non-functional. And they did not get nearly the amount of coverage as a few yahoos with weird signs at, a couple of capitals did. So, this is an ongoing thing that I wrote about and complained about and have talked to you about, Michael, about my book, that some people's protests are seen as more important than others, and they're sort of seen as like a mainstream important thing because they're aligned with Trump. Whereas, hospital nurses saying, hey guys, we don't have enough masks to actually treat people is not seen as nearly as important. So on that note,
it's a very important thing to remember, eh? Which is, I mean, maybe we shouldn't have done the show on the crazy Trump people, but they're just so goddamn entertaining, Sarah.
Well, I think it's somewhat important to make the point that actually.
No, it is. No, I agree. Send us over those articles that you've done about those the nurses organising. We'll retweet them. Always a pleasure to have you on. Keep away from the bleach, and Godspeed. I feel like even though you have like a batshit crazy president, you do have quite a large healthcare capacity. If you do have insurance, right? You've got more ventilators than us, for example.
Well, that's a good question. But anyway,
for another time. All right. Good evening. We'll speak to you soon.
See you.
That was Sarah Jaffe, author of Necessary Trouble, brilliant journalist, great friend of the show. Always great to get her thoughts on American politics and British politics. I mean, she lives here half the time, doesn't she? We're going to talk about the coming labour crunch in terms of labour shortages on farms, and also Britain's sort of odd policy of having no controls on international travel, at odds with most other countries in the world. First of all, you're watching Navarro Media, you're watching Tysky Sour. If you are new to this show but haven't yet subscribed, please do click that subscribe button. If you really enjoy what you're watching and have been tuning in, you could have been tuning in 5 days this week. Please go to navarromedia.com/support. We survive entirely on your kind donations. So if you are a supporter, thank you very much. If not, we ask for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month to keep this organization growing. Or you can give us a lockdown bonus. It's a Friday night. You might have been out tonight spending, your hard-earned money in a pub. You can't do that, so you might as well give it to us. Go on. We'll put it towards the growth of our new media organization, so that we don't have to just swallow the crap that our mainstream press has been putting out for the last few years. Okay. The coming labour crunch. Early last month, our TV screens were full of empty shelves as people stocked up to get ready for a lockdown. Back then, the problem wasn't so much, a shortage of goods, but it was a logistical problem. Those goods weren't getting to shelves. The issue is that just-in-time supply chains weren't particularly set up for a global pandemic. But the next crisis when it comes to groceries and COVID-19 could be more serious. That's because we might see a genuine shortage, not just an issue of the speed at which we can get goods to supermarkets, but how many goods are being created or made or produced in the first place. This is particularly important when it comes to vegetables, or when it comes to any agricultural produce. And that's because of the effect that coronavirus has had on international migration in this country. The picking of vegetables is nearly almost I think sort of upwards of 90% is done by migrant workers. And obviously those movements have come to a complete halt as the whole world's gone into lockdown. So the government and farmers and supermarkets are worried that there is going to be no one to pick Britain's veg. There was a story in the Times about this. We'll go to a couple of quotes from that. An online survey to mobilize a land army of farm workers was launched by the government yesterday, as it was revealed that experienced Romanian staff are training some of the British recruits. Pick for Britain aims to help recruit the 80,000 seasonal fruit and vegetable pickers that farmers say are needed for the harvest, without whom crops will be left to rot. So, this website seems like a good enough idea. No harm will be done by a portal which tries to connect people who might be out of work because of coronavirus to go and pick vegetables. But it does seem like there might be a challenge for the government, and that just creating a portal might not be enough. That's because the article goes on to explain that British workers who have sought jobs picking vegetables via existing agencies and schemes haven't necessarily found themselves ultimately picking vegetables. So it says of British workers who've applied so far, they have complained on social media that the jobs on offer are too far away from their homes, that they are expected to live on farms, share caravan accommodation with other workers, or are unable to find part-time positions. The Alliance of Ethical Labour Providers said it had received nearly 50,000 applications of interest to fill seasonal farm vacancies, but only 6,000 had opted for an interview. Concordia, part of the Alliance and one of Britain's biggest recruiters of seasonal agricultural workers, said 900 people had rejected job offers and only 112 had accepted. So, I mean, that is not an impressive ratio. So it seems like what is going on, I mean, in an overwhelming fashion, is that people think, oh, it might be nice to go and pick vegetables, especially as, you know, our country needs it, and people might be furloughed from their existing employment, or, you know, out of jobs if they're freelance. But when they find out what it will actually entail, sort of change their mind. It's a story that sort of brings back many memories of the Brexit debate, where there's a sort of argument that people are coming from other countries to steal British people's jobs, and then it turns out that British people wouldn't necessarily want to do those jobs. Aaron, this obviously, you know, isn't the same situation as Brexit. The reason there is a labour shortage and why migration has sort of reduced is because of an external shock, a pandemic which no one could have controlled. But do you think this particular issue has, you know, relevance to our broader discussions about migration and, I suppose, low-paid work as well?
Well, first of all, food production is going to massively dip globally. Whether it's wheat production, rice production, maize production, meat, vegetables is the first one, because of course they tend to be produced in Britain. You know, we have to import large amounts of wheat, for instance. That's going to be further down the line, or rice imports. The price will go up. We're going to see major inflation in regards to certain foodstuffs as this hits the global south. That's the first point. And so I think there was a kind of ideological claim to the idea that, this is just about distribution. This isn't actually about a problem of production, which of course initially it wasn't. But gradually, as people can't go to work, as they can't produce consumer durables, as people in the global south can't go and engage in agricultural work, clearly there's going to be issues around production and shortfalls. Now, what's interesting about the agriculture story here is that, yes, it, I think, offers a premonition of the post-Brexit economy. There was a story of, I've got the notes here actually, cheese growers in Cambridgeshire spent £40,000 chartering a jet to fly in 150 skilled, now apparently it's skilled now, it wasn't skilled last week, farm workers. And I think what people are going to realize very quickly is that this work is incredibly hard, very physically demanding. Only young, able-bodied people generally can do it, and it's very poorly remunerated. And that is the future of the British labour market under a hard Brexit. Yes, some people benefit from, lower levels of regulation. They can export certain things, maybe to the US, or maybe some people in legal services or the city might do okay. Actually, they probably even won't get that. But for most people with, let's call it 18, or maybe even with a degree, this is the future of the British economy. So I think it's a really, really useful story in two respects. The first about, the crisis around the production of food. Huge thing, right? A debate for years in the EU was common agricultural policy. And the French defended the common agricultural policy. Why? It wasn't just purely national self-interest, though that was a major part of it. They also said Europe has to have food security. We have to have food security. We cannot be dependent as a continent on food imports from abroad. And that was mocked. But there's an important point to that. Food security really matters in a pandemic. Being able to ensure supply chains of food is really a big deal. I think there was a great quote, you're only ever 3 meals away from, a riot. And that's true. And so I do think this is a really, really important story for a couple of reasons. And finally, the framing around it, I think, what was it? Dig for Britain. What was the title of this piece?
Pick for Britain. So Dig for Britain was explicitly from the Second World War, wasn't it? Now they've gone for Pick for Britain. Obviously a play on it.
Yeah, that's how they're going to pitch low-income, precarious work to people over the next 10 years. You're doing your bit for the national economy. No, I'm doing my bit for a capitalist enterprise. And these guys over there who own the means of production, who own the farm, who own the equipment, who I have to sell my labor to, they're exploiting me. But the great thing about a crisis is that you can frame that exploitation as actually part of a broader national effort. This isn't a war. This is a pandemic. And so people shouldn't be profiting from a pandemic. And people certainly shouldn't be subject to hyper-exploitation during a pandemic. So a really, really important story. And it's stories like this which offer you a glimpse of the future, I think.
And there's two sort of political takes which one can make, two different angles that one can come at. And I think you see people, the more sort of pro-European centrist Remainery one is to say this is why we need mass migration. The more, I suppose, Lexity one or traditional left-wing socialist one is to say this is why we need better pay and better labor rights. And in fact, actually, maybe if we turn off the tap for not low skilled as we say, but people who are willing to accept lower wages, and that will force Britain's producers to raise their wages. I mean, it's probably something in between those two realities is potentially what's going on here. I mean, it will be interesting to see if these farmers are forced to start paying better wages to encourage people to go and work on their farms. Now they can't rely on seasonal workers coming from countries where lower wages are acceptable. So it's actually, I said upwards of 90%. It's 98% of seasonal workers who pick crops in the UK normally come from Eastern Europe. So there's only 2% of people picking crops are British. By the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. So only 2% of people picking our crops are British, but it tells you something, doesn't it, about what the conditions are and who is willing to accept that.
What you hear as well is people say, oh, well, I remember in the summer holidays, Londoners would go to Kent and pick strawberries in the 1950s. Yeah, in the 1950s, people used to have polio. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. And I think you're right. There's a middle ground here between sort of Lexiteers and the Remains. It's also not a good thing that we hyper exploit Eastern Europeans to produce, to create massive profits for British farmers, or for British supermarkets. In reality, that's not a good thing either. And I think you're absolutely right. Agricultural work is something which the trade union movement on the left should just get in there and say we need, more than a living wage for these people.
All right, final story. Oh, actually, and then we are going to briefly talk about Dominic Cummings. I was finding out that he sits on SAGE, which is the group of expert advisors who are supposed to be independent. So it's a bit controversial. That broke tonight. But first of all, we're going to talk about Britain's comparatively odd policy of not having any real checks on its borders or having any extra border controls in a situation of a global pandemic. We're going to go to a story in the Financial Times, which is about the Heathrow chief who thinks our border controls are absurd. So we can get up a couple of graphics here. So the chief executive of Heathrow Airport has called on the government to introduce mass health screening checks at airports following criticism of Britain's loose border controls during the worst global pandemic for a century. So yeah, that's even the guy who's running the airport thinks that maybe this has all been a bit too liberal. Let's go to John Holland. We'll go to the next one. John Holland K sent a letter to Matt Hancock, the health secretary, on Thursday evening, urging ministers to take a lead in developing global screening standards at airports. These could include measures such as temperature checks, antibody tests, and a requirement to carry a health certificate. Then we can go to the next graphic. But Downing Street on Friday rejected the call for checks at airports, saying the government's position was based on medical and scientific advice. To this point, it has been considered that wouldn't be an effective step to take. Number 10 said, we keep everything under review and we do continue to look at what is happening elsewhere in the world. So, I mean, there is a very odd situation here where there are 15,000 people arriving every day at British airports, and they're not subject to any tests for coronavirus. I mean, the thing that's getting lots of publicity because it's kind of visual, and people find that when they go to other countries in this period of time, they get their temperature checked. That to me seems like a bit of a red herring. I think when the government say checking people's temperatures will have a very marginal impact because most people who are positive for coronavirus don't currently have a fever. It's only one of many symptoms, and there are many people who are pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. So I don't think the idea that you can sort of protect your society from incoming cases of coronavirus is helped or is made possible by those temperature checks. But for me, the most surprising thing is just that why haven't we controlled who's going in and out? Because almost everyone else has, right? I mean, Britain here is in a real minority.
Well, I don't think there's anybody else. Let's go through the numbers here. Canada shut its borders on March 16th. Denmark shut its borders on March 13th. France has stopped letting people in from non-Schengen areas, non-Schengen states since March 11th. Germany doesn't allow people in who aren't from Schengen member states. A few exceptions, Switzerland, Britain, and so on. India has banned all international flights except cargo until April 14th. Japan has a ban on 73 countries, including the US and UK, until April 3rd. New Zealand's had a ban since March 19th, except for non-permanent residents and except for permanent residents and citizens. And the United States has banned the entry of all foreign nationals who've traveled to China, Iran, Austria, Belgium, Czech Republic, Denmark, many other countries, up to 14 days for arrival. So Britain is unique. And I agree with you that the temperature testing thing, it's kind of like it's just purely performative. But hey, it wouldn't be hard to do. You know, the whole thing of, this test, it creates friction and so on. Well, okay, what's the problem with sticking a thermometer in somebody? And by the way, I wouldn't suggest that. What we should be doing is what's happening in Malta, where you basically go into quarantine for 2 weeks. You arrive, you give an address, you have to stay there. The police are checking on people once, twice a day. If you're not there, you get, I think it's a €3,000 fine. That's an incredibly easy thing to enforce. Okay, and so Britain, okay, there's only 15,000 flights coming in a day, right? So actually
15,000 people.
Yeah, sorry, my apologies. 15,000 people a day. So it's very easy to enforce, right? And you could maybe even have it a bit higher, £5,000-10,000. And I just don't understand, why wouldn't we do that? I don't get it. I just do not understand, why wouldn't we do that? There's not a huge extra cost. It might even raise revenue. So I just think, and the response you saw from Matt Hancock is, and I tweeted about it sort of just mockingly, they said, well, we already have the pandemic and we already had this crisis, and it just doesn't really seem, in the context of how it's already unfolding, it won't really change very much. Well, this is what we keep on hearing, isn't it? It's what we heard towards the end of January, then throughout February, then in March, we won't have a lockdown, it won't really change much. You know, what if we get on top of this? What if in a month's time, we're down to 100 deaths a day? We've got, that low R number, and somebody flies in from New York or from Lombardy or from part of China, and they get straight on the London Underground. I mean, it's crazy. Surely it's such a simple thing to do, and I think it speaks against the kind of the neoliberal mindset, which is just states can't do things. We can't get on top of things. We need a decisive plan, and you need to act accordingly. And there is this just ideological commitment to frictionless, international travel. Crazy.
What it also speaks to, though, because you can rationalize it, which is that, I mean, I've said all week on this show, the government now has two options as to what it's going to do next, what its exit strategy is going to be. One of them is to keep the virus moving at a low level through the population so that we don't breach our ICU capacity, but that, sort of 2% of the population have it at any one time. That's been their default strategy throughout most of this period of time. It's what Sweden are doing. The other option is to say, let's completely suppress the virus with a quite strong lockdown. And then after that, we're going to have test and trace to try and isolate and suppress the disease wherever it arises. So we're trying to keep the disease down to as few cases as feasibly possible. If you were going to do the second one, you have to close your borders. If you're going to do the first one, there's not much point in closing your borders. So the fact that they haven't introduced any restrictions on international travel is probably the best evidence there is that the government at the moment have no plans whatsoever to try and properly suppress and contain coronavirus. They're going to go for basically the Sweden strategy of let it slowly move through the population.
Yeah, I think this confirms that. And, you saw it. I think we still had people flying in from the province that surrounds Wuhan. There were still people were advised to travel there, but take precautions as the city was shutting down in China. And then they were coming back. The state wasn't monitoring them. I wrote, this was the video I made with Novara Media. And then they were advised to stay at home for 2 weeks. But again, no enforcement. You could have done the exact same thing. If the Maltese state, Malta, 300,000 people, 400,000 people, has the capacity to say, you have to stay in this property, this address for 2 weeks, or you'll be fined this amount of money. Why can't the British state do that? It is so authoritarian in so many areas. Why can't it do this particular thing in the context of a pandemic? It just speaks to the absence of crisis management and state. We see this. Deloitte, I think it was Deloitte that were running one of these testing centres.
Chessington World of Adventures.
Yeah, they're accountants. Why are Deloitte running? And it didn't work. Surprise, surprise. Just like when Capita run army recruitment or an NHS helpline, it doesn't work. Privatization, outsourcing, it doesn't work. You need an effective state to do this. It just keep on coming to the fore. And I think the policy around incoming air passengers is another example of that.
We're going to go to a question which is very relevant to what I was just saying. This is from Carl of Martin, who also gave us a £20 super chat. Thank you very much. He says, thanks for the great content. What do you think of Sweden's current refusal to lock down? And he says that he's not sure if they're doing track and trace. Eva, it's a great question. Sweden have been a real outlier in Europe and, potentially most of the world, in fact, actually, as they've decided they're not going to have a lockdown. What they have done is introduced, quite extreme social distancing measures, but kids are still going to school and you can still play sport in the park, for example. But, people are washing their hands more and they've spaced out all the tables in restaurants. So there is a considerable amount of social distancing. Their deaths are much higher than in neighboring countries. So I think they've got 3 times the level or 3 times the number of deaths relative to their population as Denmark, I think 6 times more than Norway and Finland. But the argument, so obviously, it's had a death toll, this refusal to have a lockdown. The argument that has been made for it, and what some people are a bit surprised about, is that Sweden has managed to stop the spread of coronavirus becoming exponential without a lockdown. So in Stockholm at the moment, actually the number of people in hospital beds with coronavirus is decreasing. So it was accelerating, then decelerating, and now decreasing. Much slower. That process was much slower than in neighboring countries. So in Norway and Denmark, then when the lockdown came in, you had sort of suppression of the disease spreading quite quickly and deaths falling quite quickly. That's happening slower in Sweden. But they have been able to not have a lockdown without having their ICUs collapse and having all the deaths pile up that some people were predicting. I mean, it's a country with many single households. The country in general is sort of more sparsely populated, although Stockholm isn't. It's an interesting case study. I mean, for me, the reason I wouldn't go for it is because it just seems like an unnecessary risk. There's so many things we don't know about the disease, and also the fact that lots more people are dying than in neighboring countries with a lockdown kind of is, that's the ultimate arbiter of which is the best strategy, isn't it? I know. What do you think, Aaron?
I think isn't it by surface area the second biggest country in Europe, Sweden?
Potentially, but
it's got
it's
no.
not,
Wait,
yeah,
hold on.
but
Hold on. It's got 10 million people. It's a huge country. Stockholm, for a big city, actually isn't particularly densely populated. You can't compare it to a London or a Paris. You can't. It's cold.
I mean, it's population. It's as densely populated as Greater London. I mean, I looked it up.
Yeah, but
I've never been there. Maybe it feels more spacious.
There's enclaves. I mean, Malmo, for instance, seems more densely populated than most of Stockholm. There are enclaves of London and Manchester, which are incredibly dense. There are parts like that in Stockholm as well. But I just don't think in somewhere like the Netherlands, Britain, I just don't think it would. I just don't think it would fly. And also, you've got cold weather, people less likely to be necessarily in social contact with one another. You've got a different kind of culture in regards to multi-generational families living together. Compare that to Italy. So, I mean, maybe, but like you say, I mean, the best comparison is Sweden to Norway and to Denmark, and many, many more people are dying. Is it worth looking at in the future? Perhaps, but I really don't think it'd be wise to, if you adopted a similar policy in somewhere like Italy, people going outside, multi-generational families, often very high levels of population density in Naples or Milan or Rome. I think it would be a human catastrophe.
It's worth looking at because it is the policy that's being considered by the government. And
sure.
as we spoke about before, the fact that we still haven't introduced travel bans suggests that it is the number one choice for our government, because they are accepting that the virus is going to move through the population, but we're going to have enough social distancing to keep the reproduction rate of the virus below 1, which means growth never gets exponential, but quite a lot of people die. We are going to briefly talk about Dominic Cummings being on Sage. That was revealed today. There'd already been some controversy about the fact that the people who sit on this supposedly, independent scientific advisory group had not been published. So people were like, if this group is so powerful, why do we not know who's sitting on it? There was a bit of movement from Chris Whitty and Valence, I think, who today or yesterday said they were open to it being published. But The Guardian have now broken a story that says that Dominic Cummings was actually sitting on it. And you might think, obviously there's nothing wrong with the chief advisor to the prime minister speaking to the top scientists about what our plan should be. But the issue here is that Sage isn't just a group where people meet to share opinions. it comes out with what is the authoritative advice, which is supposed to be what the government, we are told, are responding to. So when they say we're being led by the science, they're being led by SAGE. And if SAGE includes government advisors, then, you know, they're leading themselves. You know, there is no independence there between the scientists and the politicians. So as we've always said, the politicians saying we're being led by the science is a complete cop-out, and this kind of just confirms that.
Yeah, I mean, also look, Dominic Cummings is not a government advisor. He is the godfather of the sort of the policy agenda behind Boris Johnson. So it's not some conduit, you know, some gopher between Number 10 Downing Street, the strategy unit, the delivery unit, the policy unit, and then you know, the scientific community. This is somebody at the very heart of the Johnson administration, obviously, you know, participating in this in order to shape output, and that's deeply concerning. That's not what it's meant to be doing, and I think people are grasping this. Actually, you know, we said a month ago, 6 weeks ago on Novara Media, there is no such thing as an objective scientific fact when it comes to public policy. It's about interests, it's about needs, it's about people's values and ideology, and how they think certain solutions will work, and how people are motivated. All very dynamic, very, you know, flexible sort of variables in terms of what happens and when it happens. And people were treating it like it was a test in a petri dish. That's not how science works in relation to public policy. And obviously, we believe that. We knew that when we were saying it, but I don't think either of us thought, oh yeah, Dominic Cummings will be in the middle of a SAGE meeting and probably we also know his management style, right? You know, he was telling Sajid Javid's advisor, oh, you've leaked this, you have to now leave, and she was escorted out by the police. He's quite a bossy, domineering individual. And so given his record, would he be behaving any differently in SAGE? You know, that's a really important question we now need to get answers to.
Well, I mean, yeah, I suppose I'm almost relieved that we're actually now questioning the scientific advice, because there was such a long period of time whereby mainstream journalists, we've talked about it loads on this show, were just refusing to question government policy because they were saying, well, if the scientists say it, who are you to question what the chief medical officer has to say? But one thing that has been really clear, especially this week, actually, is that, well, at least the government seem very reluctant to admit what seems to be their default plan. So the chief medical officer he spoke at a press conference in the middle of the week, and he was saying that, okay, yeah, testing will be part of our strategy, but ultimately we're going to have to keep social distancing for quite a while. And that looked like a Sweden strategy. That's to say, we'll let it move through the population kind of slowly, and we won't overwhelm our ICUs. Then the following day, Matt Hancock comes out and he says, actually, no, we're going to try and get it down as low as possible and have a test and trace system. And I think that's because he's now got a sense of the public mood. I'm still not convinced that, and I would prefer the policy that he was sort of outlining. I'm still not convinced that is the policy because of all the reasons we've said. They still haven't shut down international travel, which would be a precondition of a successful sort of hammer and dance policy. But anyway, Fox is saying SAGE stands for Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. We are going to clock out now. Aaron, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
My pleasure. I just want to say to people, please smash the like button. Have a great weekend.
I hope you all have a relaxing weekend in your houses. Maybe you've got a balcony. Maybe you can go for a nice hour walk around your park. This won't last forever, but while we have been in lockdown, it has been wonderful to have your company every evening. Gives me something to wake up for in the morning. So thank you for watching. If you're not already, please hit that subscriber button. I really want to get us up to 100,000 soon. As Aaron said, hit the like button, keep your comments coming, and go to novaramedia.com/support to help us financially. We'll be back on Monday. Good night.